All right, so I'll go ahead and kind of do another round of introductions. For those of you who have been on here for a minute, you've already heard everything, but we'll kind of go through some housekeeping stuff. My name is Jeff Shorgen. I'm the Ag and Natural Resources Educator from Wabash County. We, as educators in my area, came together last year and kind of figured we would like to do a sort of program that highlights specialists on campus. There are educators in every county. In Indiana, we are Purdue employees based out in the county. But there's a lot of times where we don't know the answers. And so when we don't know those answers, we fall upon specialists on campus. So our first speaker for this series, our Hot Topics 2023, is Ashley Adair. She is on campus. I'll let her kind of explain her position and do all that sort of thing. Just a couple things to kind of cover. One, we do have a big crowd today on Zoom, so if you could make sure that your mute button is on so we don't have too much background noise. Any questions you guys have, please direct them to the chat box. We've got some educators who are on standby to have those ready. Am I missing anything, Courtney or Krista?
The demo poll.
Just the poll.
Yep, so we are going to go ahead and put that poll up real quick. And then after that, Ashley, the time is yours. We'll just give this about a minute or two. And it looks like we still have some individuals coming in from the weight room. So we've got a poll up. If you guys could answer those questions real quick, we'd really appreciate that. That helps us with our numbers to get sort of our demographics. There will be a link in the chat box at the end of the presentation for you guys to put feedback in. I mentioned earlier that this is our first Extension Hot Topics class for the series. So any feedback you guys have, we're going to look at those pretty hard because this is something we want to keep doing and highlighting those campus specialists and what they do. So Krista, whenever you think we're good, we can end that poll.
I think we got most people. I think we're pretty good at slowing down.
All right. So if we're good there, appreciate you guys answering all that. And then Ashley, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you spending the lunch hour with me today, and I'm excited to present to such a large group of everyone. So it's just nice to see so many people interested in some of these extension hot topics. And thanks to Jeff and the other educators in the room with us and other educators around the state who have helped promote this event. So I'm excited to talk to you a bit about organic gardening and composting. My name, as you already know, is Ashley Adair. My official title at Purdue is the Extension Organic Agriculture Specialist. And part of my job is to talk to folks like you, talk to the general public about organic agriculture, gardening, organic farming in general. I have a whole litany of different topics I work on here on campus, everything from organic row crop to organic perennial agriculture and pretty much everything in between. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of events that I speak at. And while I am specialized in organic agriculture, what I do is still kind of broad. So we look at all cropping systems in the organic extension program here. Don't dabble quite so much in the livestock side. So if you have questions about that, we can definitely direct you to somebody who will get you some good answers on that. But I will just fully admit that livestock is not my specialty, I'm really a plants person. So without further ado, let's jump right in. What's the organic matter? We're going to introduce you to organic gardening and composting both. We won't be able to spend a ton of time on either one. So this is very much intended to be an introductory level exploration of these different topics and hopefully bring some questions to mind for you that you can feel free to reach out to your local extension educator or reach out to me directly to get some more information and more resources. But Organic is kind of a buzzword, right? So I want to explore what exactly is organic gardening from a maybe a misconception standpoint, or just some of the things that some of the words and phrases that surround organic, whether you're looking at stuff at the grocery store, at the farmer's market, or something along those lines. So there's a few different things here on the slide that some of them are opinions, some of them are true information about organic agriculture and organic gardening. So no synthetic inputs. That's one that's a pretty big tenet of organic. That one is accurate about organic gardening, with a few very nuanced exceptions. Some folks consider organic gardening the natural way. So natural is a word that gets thrown around that doesn't have an explicit legal meaning, whereas when we talk a little bit about USDA organic and the symbol that comes along with that, there's some actual legal definitions that follow that. So gardening naturally is kind of a gray area for organic. In some ways, organic gardening can be environmentally friendly. In other ways, there are some issues with organic that may not be considered so environmentally friendly. We won't dive too deeply into those nuances today, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there's good and bad with everything, and organic gardening and organic agriculture is no exception. In many cases, organic gardening and organic agriculture tends to use fewer inputs, but there might be more inputs of a particular thing. So tillage, for example, while you wouldn't consider that an input like an herbicide or an insecticide, that is an input of energy and labor that has some other effects that may be good, may be bad, depending on how that's used. And then this is one that it's a very big gray area for me, whether organic is actually healthier than conventional, depending on what facet of organic we're looking at. But what we do know is that in many cases, organic gardening tends to expose the gardener to less pesticide residue. Now, that's not to say that organic gardening doesn't use pesticides at all, but the types of pesticides used and the frequency at which some of those products are used is generally going to result in less exposure to very toxic chemicals to the gardener themselves. So that's important to think about. All of these things are, either true, partially true, or maybe have some nuances to them. But what we can explore in a little more detail is some of these legal definitions of what organic means. So if you were to sell produce with the USDA organic label, you would have to follow the federal rules, what the USDA has set out for what organic actually means. So gardening without synthetic inputs is kind of the top tenet of organic gardening. And if you want to go full on USDA organic, you have to follow an organic systems plan. And this is also if you're selling produce more than $6,000 in a year. So you can call something organic if you're not making a ton of money off of it. But once you make so much money, it's regulated. But I think the really important thing about organic agriculture is that you're seeing the whole garden or the whole farm as an ecosystem. And where can you make tweaks in that ecosystem to reduce your inputs and promote overall harmony in the landscape? It's not easy necessarily, but taking a systems approach to agriculture, in particular, organic agriculture, can yield a lot of downstream benefits. I want to touch on a brief history of organic agriculture, or really what some call the organic movement, but really is how we farmed for thousands of years up until, the last 100 years or so. So agriculture was practiced with what we would call organic practices for thousands of years, dating back to ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia or ancient North America. There are so many different indigenous methods of producing food that didn't use, synthetic chemicals and some of the things that we're more accustomed to using today because they are efficient and reduce some of our labor and can be very good at what they do. But we have a storied history as humans growing food organically over thousands of years. So once we get to about the turn of the century and into the 1910s, 1920s, agriculture starts to go through kind of an industrial revolution, just like, the general industrial revolution we were going through around that time. So agriculture was starting to suffer from some specific issues like destruction of soil quality and soil health. And so there's a series of kind of important figures in organic agriculture that I just wanted to touch on briefly so you kind of know where this comes from. And we're going to start with Rudolf Steiner, who is a founder of the certified biodynamic label. So back in the 20s, the mid 20s, in Central Europe, Steiner delivered a series of lectures kind of decrying some of the issues with so-called modern agricultural practices because of his concern about soil, crop, and livestock quality declines after using some of these practices for multiple years. So he referred to these lectures as the spiritual foundations for the renewal of agriculture. And at its core, Steiner believed that farms, gardens, et cetera, should be viewed more like a self-contained organism rather than a factory that's consuming inputs and creating outputs. So this is a systems approach. Granted, he had a bit of a spiritual bent on this, and part of biodynamic agriculture, if you become certified in that, involves some spiritual practices. We can talk about those a little bit if you have questions at the end. I don't want to belabor that too much, but just one of the many ways that folks kind of came to this organic or ecosystems focused approach and how that is different from what industrializing agriculture looked like at the time. There are about 50 countries in the world that recognize biodynamic farms and their certification process. Also, if you've ever heard of the Waldorf School or Waldorf schools in general, Steiner was the founder of that type of schooling. So he may be more familiar to you from that standpoint. We also have in England, we have the lady Eve Balfour. She's one of the forerunning women in soil health and agriculture at the time. And she was one of the first women to study agriculture at an English university. And she founded and served as president of the Soil Association and ran a unique experiment called the Hawley experiment. And this was the first comparison of so-called chemical farming methods with organic farming methods in the UK and really in Europe in general at the time. And in this book, she promotes the idea that the way we treat our soil is reflected in the quality of our food and our health. So many of those things do end up becoming connected. And the book, The Living Soil, also describes the results of the Hawley experiment. We also have Sir Albert Howard, and I'm mentioning him because he's considered the father of modern composting. So we're going to talk about compost in the latter half of the presentation. And I think he's kind of an important figure for, I guess, modernizing a composting method that had been done for thousands of years in India. He was the agriculture minister for India at the time when India was under British rule. So there's some colonizing aspects to that and some other, nuanced history that I'm not going to get into here. But he did write this book called An Agricultural Testament. And in his works, he describes humus, which is a fundamental component of healthy soil, fungal mycorrhizae, and he also describes soil water and how all of those things are important for growing healthy food. So he's an important figure in the 1940s, just as Lady Eve Balfour was. Now let's come back stateside. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Rodale Institute, which is a place in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, that has been doing a long-term experiment showing the differences between conventional agriculture and organic agriculture over the course of several decades. So J.I. Rodale is the founder of that particular research site. And this is also in the 1940s. And he was also the founder of the Organic Gardening and Farming magazine, in addition to several other publications that you may be familiar with, like Men's Health and Prevention. So his publication agency put together all of those types of publications. And Rodale was really the first person to define organic as farming without the use of pesticides. So that definition carries through with synthetic pesticides today. And Rodale was a really interesting and kind of controversial figure. And we can talk more about him a little bit as well if you're interested. But he was a combination of well-meaning and interested in providing evidence for for organic agriculture being an improvement over conventional agriculture, but he also had some kind of quackery aspects to him. So just as anyone else, he's a complicated figure. And, got to take some of what comes from the work that he did early in his career with maybe a grain of salt. But the Rodale Institute today employs scientists and other qualified folks that are taking a very close look at organic agriculture over time. And then I would be remiss not to mention George Washington Carver as part of this. Now, while not explicitly calling what he was doing organic agriculture, George Washington Carver was promoting several tenets of organic agriculture in his own work at the Tuskegee Institute in the 1940s and prior to that. He promoted crop diversification. So folks that were depleting the soil with cotton, he was advocating adding sweet potatoes and peanuts in the South, where soils were depleted by this perennial cotton agriculture. And he was also promoting techniques to improve soil fertility, which is part of what we call soil health today. So diversification and soil health are very important aspects of organic gardening and organic agriculture. And George Washington Carver was also an important figure from an extension standpoint. And as an extension professional, I really appreciate that he took so much time to put together more than 40 different bulletins that encouraged farmers to implement new practices on their land to improve the soil. So those are just a few of the people that are kind of foundational people in organic agriculture. And those folks, as well as talks throughout the last few decades, have led to what today is the USDA organic standard. I've listed a few different standards for crop production here. There's a whole other set of standards for animal agriculture that I'm not going to get into. But for crop production, you can see some of the general guidelines here for anybody wanting to practice organic. So if you want to certify your land as organic, you can't apply a prohibited substance for at least 3 years before harvesting a crop and marketing it as organic. You can't use any seed that's produced through genetic engineering. And then there's a few other interesting things, like you can't sanitize anything with ionizing radiation. And you can't use something like sewage sludge for fertilizer. So there's a whole litany of other crop production standards as well. These are some of the main ones. And now let's go ahead and get into organic gardening. What are some reasons why, whether you certify your land or not, that doesn't really matter, because as a gardener, you might be just producing this food for yourself and your family, or giving it away, or maybe just selling a little bit at the farmer's market. So certification doesn't really come into play with that. So what are some reasons why you might consider gardening organically at home? One of those, which we've already touched on some today, is reducing human exposure to pesticides. So whether it's an insecticide or an herbicide of some kind, if you're gardening organically, you're not going to be using many of those types of products. There's also the chance that you're going to reduce pesticide residue on your food, so that in turn keeps you from being exposed to it. You're also reducing potential risks to wildlife, pets, and the environment. So we all know that it's very important to minimize pesticide residue, and in particular insecticide residue, so that we don't harm our beneficial insects. But wildlife, pets, and your family are also important in trying to minimize overall risk to them and their health. And then finally, increasing the activity of naturally occurring beneficial insects and microbes. So we're talking about both above the soil and below the soil. There is evidence that organic practices do improve microbial communities and do enhance the quality of insect communities in environments where it is practiced. So those are just a handful of reasons why you might consider gardening organically. Some of the general principles of organic gardening include building the soil. That's probably the biggest one we're going to talk about today, since we have composting on the docket as well. We're going to really focus on that soil quality aspect. But several of the other aspects are really important as well. Probably in organic, more so than in conventional, choosing the right plant for the right place is paramount. Practicing prevention is also part of that. So if you're choosing the right plant for the right place, you're choosing something that's going to be able to thrive in that area with limited intervention from you as the gardener, or from, a chemical product of some kind. We also are minimizing the use of synthetic inputs. There are a handful of synthetic inputs that can be used in organic agriculture. But we are taking some tools out of the toolbox when we decide to grow organically. So we're going to focus on some of our non-synthetic inputs, which include different types of fertilizer, different techniques for weed control, and a few other things. And then finally, using integrated pest management techniques is of utmost importance in organic ag and incorporates basically all of the other principles that are ahead of it. So IPM can help you mitigate some of your pest control issues, and also could potentially change your outlook on what is an optimum control level for certain types of pests that you may have dealt with in the past. So like you might have to tolerate some Colorado potato beetle, or you might have to tolerate some cabbage moth or cabbage butterfly larva or something like that, or maybe tolerate a few extra holes in your produce. It does take some labor out of it. So, there's trade-offs with everything, but using IPM and figuring out which varieties might be resistant to a particular insect, or different geometries of, organizing your garden or rotating your crops to make sure that you're not exacerbating any existing pest or disease issues. So like I said, we're going to really focus on this build the soil aspect today. So why is building the soil important? And we're going to take you back on a little bit of a chemistry lesson here, a little bit of soil science for you today. One thing that's really important to remember about soil is that soil is negatively charged. So that means any ion, any mineral, any nutrient that a plant might be wanting to take up is going to stick to the soil with a positive charge. Now, if your soil is not very sticky, your soil might be sandy, or if your soil is sandy, it might not be very sticky. So sand doesn't really have a charge associated with it, but soil particles like clay and organic matter can maintain that negative charge and make the soil stickier for different types of ions or nutrients to stick to. So you can see that here in this diagram. We've got calcium, we've got magnesium, we've got potassium, we've got aluminum. All of these different ions are important for plant health in some way and in some quantity. And all those little ions are stuck to this little particle of clay here. Now, we can't just go and add clay to the soil. Clay is kind of an intrinsic component of the soil and of whatever the soil is made of, which we call the parent material. So how can we increase the stickiness of the soil and increase its ability to hang on to these minerals, these nutrients? Well, the one thing we can do is add organic matter. So that's what OM stands for in this diagram. Organic matter also carries a negative charge. So in addition to working with a soil that has clay in it, which most soil is going to have a certain proportion of clay, we can add organic matter to the soil to create more of these little negative charges, more of these little sites for these ions to grab onto. And then that enables plant roots with these little root hairs to grab onto those ions and then incorporate those ions into the plant tissue. Now you can see there's little hydrogen ions marked on the plant root hairs there. And just for a little bit of extra context, the plant chemically is pretty amazing. It will pump those hydrogen ions out of the root hairs in order to grab on to those other ions. And so if any of you are familiar with the concept of liming soil, the reason we need to lime our soil from time to time is because plants are pumping hydrogen ions out into the soil matrix, which makes the soil acidic. Free-floating hydrogen ions make soil acidic over time. So that's why if you grow crops in a particular area for a long time, you might need to sweeten it up a little bit with lime, but always test your soil first to see exactly how much you need. So hard science aside, all this chemistry stuff aside, let's talk about some ways we can add organic matter to our organic garden or even our conventional garden, because every garden can benefit from organic matter. Few different ways. One of them is crop residue. You have to be careful with crop residue because sometimes crop residue hangs on to diseases and insects and that kind of thing for the next year. So that's why crop rotation is so important. But you can also throw that crop residue and even mulch residue from leaves or other materials in your yard. You can throw that into compost and help kind of take care of some of those problems. Other ways to add organic matter are to use cover crops or use cover crops as a green manure. So anything that's actively growing in the soil that you then incorporate before it sets seed is going to provide some biological material for those microbes to chew up and spit out and make into a soil that has more organic matter in it. So those are just a few ways to add organic matter. I'm a big proponent of cover crops, even in the home garden, even if it's in a raised bed or something small. I think cover crops can give you a lot of bang for your buck, and they're kind of fun to watch grow, and they provide some habitat for beneficial insects. And, there's all kinds of good things that they do. If you got questions about those, let me know. We can talk about that later. Now let's talk about some organic inputs that can help feed the soil, help feed your plants. So it's going to look a little bit different than your typical nitrogen source that's provided by a synthetic fertilizer. The main way it's going to look different is that it's going to have a lower nitrogen percentage than many of our conventional fertilizers. Since all of these products are produced either as a plant byproduct or an animal byproduct, there's just a lower concentration of some of these of nitrogen in some of these products. So let's talk about plant byproducts. That includes alfalfa meal, corn gluten, cottonseed, soybean meal, that kind of thing. Those products are all good to use. The nitrogen that's contained within them may not be available right away. So even if it's 2 to 9% nitrogen, you may only expect to have half or 75% of that released in your first year. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use them, but it does mean that there is just a little bit of a learning curve in kind of predicting when that nitrogen is going to be most beneficial to your crop. Now, animal byproducts, those typically become more available more quickly, but there's still a huge range of different nitrogen contents within this set of animal byproducts. And those byproducts include things like manure, dried blood or blood meal, feather meal, fish emulsion, and bat guano. So there's a whole bunch of different products that you might see at the garden center when it comes to choosing an organic animal byproduct. Now, manure typically needs to be composted first because there's a little bit of safety issue with potential pathogens that might be carried along with it. So make sure if you're buying a manure product that it has been composted and processed already. That's just a word of caution from a safety standpoint, but the rest of these products are generally accepted as safe to use. And it would be a disservice to you if we didn't talk a little bit about organic phosphorus and potassium sources, because these are all essential plant nutrients and are needed in greater quantities than some of our other products like magnesium and calcium and that kind of thing. So phosphorus can come in the form of bone meal, a product called colloidal phosphate, or even rock phosphate. Most of these products are available as a certified organic product if you're looking for something like that, but they're all slow release. So don't put a bunch of it down and expect it to disappear quickly or expect all the plants in your garden to be able to use it super quickly. They should be used cautiously because they're slow release and they can build up pretty readily if you use too much at once. And then potassium comes in a variety of sources as well. One of the most historical sources is actually wood ash. That contains potassium. That's why it's called potash. It's a product from burning wood, essentially. It does tend to have a high pH. So if you're worried about pH in your garden, and based on my experience testing soil in people's backyards and gardens as an extension educator several years ago, there's a lot of high pH gardens out there. So that's something to pay attention to with wood ash. But some of these other products like sulfomag, green sand, granite dust, those types of things don't necessarily have as much of an issue with that. All right, so let's bring it back around. We've talked about building the soil and different amendments that you can use as an organic gardener to improve soil organic matter and to improve soil fertility. But let's skip over those other two and talk a little bit about practicing prevention and using integrated pest management techniques. So we'll touch on weeds and insect management just a little bit here. Weeds are obviously one of the biggest problems for an organic gardener. There is really no super efficient way to take care of weeds. Nothing like going out with an herbicide of choice and being able to use that in a particular situation in your lawn or garden. So we've got weeds to deal with that can very quickly get out of hand. So you have to change your mindset when it comes to organic gardening and make sure that you're scouting for weeds and using multiple techniques in order to manage weeds effectively. And in case you're curious, this photo on the right, that is a picture of me in front of an organic cornfield that really probably looks more like it's just ragweed, because there is a lot of ragweed in there. So hopefully none of you are seeing giant ragweed of that stature in your garden or in your sweet corn or anything like that. But it just goes to show that weeds are a huge challenge, and we have fewer tools in our toolbox to manage them as organic gardeners and organic farmers than we do if we're using conventional strategies. So let's talk about prevention. You should be incorporating multiple methods, multiple strategies into your weed management scheme in order to control and mitigate the life cycle of multiple species of weeds. So you're going to see, like, if you're going from organic to conventional, you're going to see weed species that you forgot about on your lawn, garden, or farm that you haven't seen in a long time. So we have to use a lot of strategies. One of the strategies that tends to work very well is using a mulch to physically prevent weeds from accessing light and physically prevent them from emerging from the ground. So plastic mulch is commonly used, especially on commercial vegetable operations, but there are many organic mulches that you can use that include straw, that includes wood chips, and all of those things can be used together as a strategy to prevent weeds from getting out of the ground in the first place. Cultivation and hand weeding is going to be a part of anybody's life as they're managing organic gardens and organic farms. So having the right tools, so the right hand tools, the right, if you, let's say you have a wheel hoe, or you have a set of scuffle hoes or stirrup hoes, you're going to want to have a few different tools available for different purposes in order to mitigate this weed problem once those weeds have emerged from the ground. There is no substitute for hand weeding and doing weeding this way once those weeds have emerged. So even though you're using all of these other strategies, you should be expecting that you're going to have to hand weed at least a little bit from time to time. Another important concept is preventing weeds from going to seed in the first place. So if you do have weeds escape, make sure that they don't have an opportunity to set flowers and spread seed everywhere. So in the case of Canada thistle, let's say you have a Canada thistle escape near your garden, somewhere maybe along the fence edge in your yard or something like that. If it gets out of the ground, it's pretty much too late for those, and they get really big really quick. But one way that you can kind of help prevent it from becoming a bigger problem is to cut the flowers off when you see them. Or if they start to set seed, cut those off and try to throw them away in the trash or something. Do what you can to prevent weeds from spreading seed everywhere. Mowing is a strategy you can do for that as well, making sure that things are kept neat and tidy around the garden and around your yard. In other situations, like if you have forages or if you have a larger row crop situation, you can use mowing on a grander scale to help prevent weeds from going to seed and just keep things neat and tidy altogether. Now, there are several strategies here that come with a certain amount of danger, I guess you could say, but they're really sexy. So we're talking about flame weeding. We're talking about using boiling water. We're talking about steam. There are some folks that are on commercial vegetable operations that will steam their soil just to kill weed seed. It also is going to kill some microbes and kill some of your beneficial life. But if you got a huge weed problem, large scale steaming might be a thing for a commercial operator to do. Flame weeding is definitely something that's available to a small scale grower. It's got a certain level of danger that's involved with it. I mean, just look at this image here at the Great Lakes Expo, which is a specialty crop convention that's held in Grand Rapids, Michigan every year. They have a flamethrower there. It's called the Pulse Fire that it looks amazing, but it also looks terrifying and looks like there could be some potential learning curve and safety issues with using something like that in a small garden, for example. So it's not to say that it's not an option, but it comes with a learning curve and comes with a risk that you might damage your crop in addition to damaging the weeds, because none of these methods are selective like some of our conventional herbicides are. Another strategy you might consider using is cover cropping to prevent weeds from gathering the resources they need to survive. So if you crowd them out with a desirable cover crop, that might be a good strategy for you. And then finally, there are a handful of bioherbicides that are available. So let's talk about those a bit. Some of them do not meet the National Organic Program requirements because of certain chemical composition that might be involved in the product. So the product itself, the actual active ingredient, might be something allowed under organic rules, but there might be a carrier or, like an emulsifier or some type of chemical component in the formula that prevents it from being certified organic. So that one in particular that kind of falls into that category is called scythe. It's a pelargonic acid, and acids are used as basically a contact herbicide. They prevent the plant from doing what it needs to do because it's changing the pH of all of the outside of the plant and basically killing it. But that one is not considered certified organic because of the carrier that's in that product. You can always cross-list any of these items by going to the Organic Materials Review Institute website, omri.org, and they will list products that are certified for use under organic practices in the US, in Mexico, in Canada, and may point you to some other resources if we're talking about the EU, because every country has some kind of nuanced rules about this. But there are several products available. Corn gluten meal is one that has received a lot of attention as a potential organic herbicide. It doesn't work like a traditional herbicide. It's mostly just preventing weeds from popping out of the ground, and then it serves as a fertilizer product for whatever cash crop that you might be growing. So I hesitate to call it an herbicide exactly because the mode of action isn't exactly how an herbicide works. But we also have things like herbicidal soap. We have essential oils. We have acetic acid and citric acid. And some of those products are labeled for certain types of species of weeds, and some of them have varying efficacy. What I will not recommend to you is to make your own herbicide. There's folks that will ask, well, can I mix vinegar and sea salt together to make an herbicide of some kind? And I'm like, well, I guess technically yes, but legally that's something that we as extension people can't recommend because there's not a set recipe for it. If it's manufactured by a chemical manufacturer and goes through the EPA labeling process for certain types of plants that it can be used on, then that's something like, hey, we could recommend you could use a citric acid product like All Down or Burnout or something like that, but we cannot recommend that you make your own at home. Now let's touch on insects a bit before we change gears and discuss composting methods. Organic management of insects is going to involve understanding the pest life cycle and also involve kind of changing your expectations about what you expect to see out of insects. You are not going to have an insect-free garden if you're gardening organically. And that, in my opinion, is okay. If the insects are not hanging out in your garden, that means they don't want to eat anything that's there. And I want to eat stuff that's in the garden. If the insects want to eat stuff that's in the garden, then I think they have good taste. But you can still manage them by understanding their life cycle and understanding the different ways that you can disrupt the life cycle of the particular problem insects that you have in the garden. So many of the insecticides in particular that are synthesized from naturally occurring chemicals, so products that are allowed for use under organics, include products like pyrethrins, which are actually very effective. Pyrethrins are extracted from chrysanthemum species, and chrysanthemum species are known for having insect-resistant capabilities. And if that stuff is concentrated down into a higher concentration, then you can apply those pyrethrins to insects and get a pretty effective kill. But if you're going to use a pyrethrin product, you also need to make sure you're checking the label, because there's products out there called pyrethroids, which are nearly identical in function and chemical composition, but they're produced synthetically. So that's not allowed under National Organic Program rules. So some of the other strategies here, so we'll talk a little bit more about insecticides again in a second, but what you're primarily going to be doing as an organic gardener is using cultural practices like crop rotation, using well-timed tillage, planning your planting dates and using multiple plantings, and even potentially using trap crops as methods of mitigating the effects of insects. One really common one that I like to use as an example is preventing squash vine borer from attacking your zucchinis and your summer squash by making sure you're planting outside of the window where they're laying their eggs. So just a little bit earlier or a little bit later, usually a little bit later, is going to be better for those particular crops, so that you don't end up having a crop loss because you find these big, huge caterpillars burrowing into the stem of your zucchini plants. Now, there's also physical barriers. So using something like a spun bonded fabric as a floating row cover, so you can exclude certain types of insects like cabbage butterflies from being able to lay eggs on your brassicas. But sometimes those floating row covers will exclude things like honeybees and bumblebees and other pollinators. So there might be some timing worth looking at for opening those up, maybe between 10 and noon throughout a certain time period, so that those plants can get pollinated if they need to be. Your brassicas probably don't need to get pollinated necessarily, but just as an example, there might be times where you might want to let the pollinators in and then try to make sure that, maybe it's a windy afternoon and they're all out of there, and then you can close that back down and make sure the cabbage butterflies or other pest insects don't get in there. We've also got mechanical control, which includes flaming again, so that can potentially help kill some of the eggs and larvae that might exist in the soil. But there's also vacuuming. So there are commercially available products, both for in the home and also in agriculture, where you can literally just suck the bugs off of the surface that you don't want them on. So one example seen in the slide here is called the Bugzooka, which is an as seen on TV product. So take that for what you will. But vacuuming is a viable solution and is actually often used in entomology research to keep plants clean. You can also foster an environment for natural enemies like lacewings and ladybug larvae and some of those other beneficial insects to colonize the area around your garden and then become really important predators of some of the pest insects that you might be dealing with, like aphids, for example. And then finally, just to touch on some more allowable insecticides before we move on, some of those include plant essential oils, which are toxic to insects. Some of those include horticultural oils, which if you douse a plant with that oil is physically suffocating the insects and their eggs. Soap tends to be damaging to soft-bodied insects like aphids, once again. There's products like kaolin clay and diatomaceous earth, which can physically damage the insects' bodies. And then there's microbial control like Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a type of bacteria which will infect and damage the vital organs of a particular insect. And there's certain species of BT that affect certain species of insects more. So without further ado, we're going to talk about using microbes in a slightly different way and talk about composting for the latter half of the presentation today. So organic gardening often goes hand in hand with the application of compost. Compost is a really useful material that serves part as fertilizer and part as soil conditioner for the organic gardener. And want to touch on just some of the basics of composting today. So compost it's all organic matter and it's made of decomposed materials. And those materials are either carbon heavy materials or nitrogen heavy materials. And we call the carbon heavy ones browns and the nitrogen heavy ones greens. Compost is a particularly beneficial soil amendment. And it's usually pretty readily available depending on where you live. You may have access to a municipal compost, which has some drawbacks and challenges, but there is likely that you have a compost source nearby, or you can embark on making your own compost pretty easily. So organic matter, again, is a very important feature for soil generally, but specifically for the organic gardener, you can expect organic matter to increase the water holding capacity of soil, increase the microbial activity of soil, which helps push the nitrogen cycle forward and provides nutrients and nutrient availability to your plants. Compost can improve soil texture. It can improve the buffering capacity of soil and improve its resilience to weather conditions and changes in pH. And it can also reduce plant disease pressure if there's proper drainage. Now, that's not to say that too much compost is always a good thing. There is such a thing as applying too much compost. It can really become troublesome if let's say you have 20% organic matter in your soil, which I've definitely heard of, especially in some urban gardening situations. then you don't really have a lot for your plant roots to grab onto. The soil, the composted soil can be very, very friable and kind of hard to work with. So we always want to make sure that we're applying this type of product judiciously and cautiously, but still want to point out compost has a lot of benefits. So what's compost made of generally? So some examples of these different carbon heavy and nitrogen heavy materials. So browns can involve leaf litter, like the leaves from your lawn. It can involve things like corn cob and corn meal. It can involve sawdust, and then it can involve things like paper. Each one of those items has a different carbon to nitrogen ratio. Same thing with the greens. So greens can involve materials like manure. It can involve coffee grounds, it can involve grass clippings, and even something like hair. Hair is a very protein-rich thing that you could potentially consider adding to your compost, as long as it doesn't have any pathogens associated with it. And sometimes you might want to watch out for dyed hair, just because there's a chemical process that goes into dyeing hair. And then there's also eggshells. Now, eggshells kind of fall into the category of greens, but they're useful for adding a little bit of calcium to that composted material, which could be potentially helpful depending on what your soil test looks like and what your soil might need. So I'm not going to go through these individually, because you'll receive a copy of these slides if you would like a copy after the presentation is over with. But this is some common carbon to nitrogen ratios for several different materials that you might consider adding to a compost pile. Notice that many of these are provided as a range. So it's important to note that even if you're putting something like paper into your compost pile, that the exact carbon to nitrogen ratio isn't going to be known unless you send it off for testing, which most folks are not going to do unless they're participating in some kind of research. So just be aware that ranges are given to help you understand that, like if you put wood chips in a compost pile, that carbon to nitrogen ratio is a lot higher than for leaves. So just understanding some of the relative differences and not being so concerned about it as being a super exact science. Now, there's two types of composting that we'll talk about in terms of microbial compost, which is probably the most common type of compost and the one that you're most familiar with. Commercial producers are going to use hot composting, which is the fastest method. It can take as little as 2 weeks to complete a full compost cycle, depending on what time of year it is and how hot it is outside. It's labor intensive. It requires a high input requirement. So you have to have all of your composting material ready to go to put in the pile immediately. This is not a continuous feed type of process. Hot composting is best for killing weeds and pathogens, because that compost pile can reach a temperature of upwards of 145 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit within a handful of days. But the vast majority of us are going to be using what we call cool compost. So that's the slower method. It's a less intensive management. It's a continuous feed process. It can take at least 3 months to finish, sometimes upwards of a year. But you can add things as you go. It's less labor intensive. You don't have to turn the pile over every day. You can wait 6 weeks or so. But the downside to cool composting, obviously, you're waiting longer for it to be finished, but it doesn't necessarily kill weeds and pathogens as readily as a hot compost pile would. So it's not going to be able to neutralize weed seeds or necessarily take care of all the plant disease that you might have in the garden. So you have to be careful about what kinds of residue that you consider putting into your compost pile, especially if you're going to be applying that compost to the garden or plan to apply that compost to the garden within the next year. So let's talk about how to start a basic cool compost pile. So you want to shoot for a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 25 or 30 to 1. So more carbon than nitrogen. You might consider having enough material ready for about a 3 by 3 by 3 foot cube, but some of you might be considering starting compost in a food grade bucket, like a 5-gallon bucket or something like that. You're not going to have enough material for that amount. So just try to keep the proportions very similar. And you will have to water your compost. It's kind of like having a house plant. You want to make sure that the compost feels kind of like a damp sponge instead of being very dry or very, very wet. If it's too wet, you can agitate the compost to help aerate it and dry it out a little bit. So following those guidelines, you should be off to a pretty good start. You'll have a variety of materials you can use to get that started. That could be lawn clippings, sawdust, some food waste. Just make sure you're not adding dairy products or meat to that particular compost. That will be stinky and gross really, really quickly, and potentially a pathogen problem, and maybe attract all the raccoons and possums in your neighborhood to your compost pile. Now, let's talk about, there's a few different organization methods you could use. Lasagna layering is one way that you could do this, which means you're putting a layer of browns, then a layer of greens, and then a layer of browns, and then a layer of, let's say, straw or something like that. So you're putting things down in layers. Those layers are going to deplete in volume over time. And it's kind of inefficient, but it's probably the easiest way to create compost, but it is going to take a long time to get there. Commonly used are 3-stage outdoor bays, where you'll put most of your raw materials in the first bay, and then once that starts to break down, you move some of that material into the second bay, and as that material starts to break down, you put essentially what's finished compost in your third bay, and that volume will also decrease quite a bit over time. And then you can always do the simple pile or simple bucket method, where you're just kind of throwing things in there, agitating it from time to time, and making sure it stays watered until it's ready to go. And now let's touch on containers. I tell you what, I think the internet is made for looking at pictures and videos of cats, but it's also made for looking at pictures and videos of different compost bin designs. Like, that's all the internet is: compost bin designs and cats. There are so many different compost bin designs available on the internet. They all have merits and all of them have drawbacks, but commonly you will see wooden compost bins, plastic buckets and barrels, and maybe even bins that are made out of old pallets. Now, my recommendation would be, especially if you're going organic, you would not want to use pressure treated lumber for these types of applications, because of some of the processes that goes through and the potential that that treatment can leach into the soil or the compost that you're trying to make. So that's kind of an organic production recommendation. But many of these designs are very easy to make at home and very cheaply. Some of the designs will keep critters out, some of them won't. So just kind of determine what you are thinking with that, and especially where you're going to keep the bins, if they're indoor or outdoor. They can be made very big, they can be very small, they can be open topped, or they can be closed lidded. So lots of different choices there. One choice that folks may like to make is compost tumblers. So they have a larger capacity than some of the bins that are available. There are store-bought versions and DIY plans for these. They allow for easy turning and aeration. So that's one of the biggest boons to using a compost tumbler versus having a pile that you have to get out there with a pitchfork and flip over. However, if you're going to build a DIY unit, you have to be conscientious of just how much all of this stuff is going to weigh. So if your compost is going to be 50 or 60% water, water is pretty heavy. So if you're going to build something out of a 55-gallon food grade plastic drum, like you see on the bottom left image there, you have to make sure that whatever you're mounting that to can really handle the weight of having all that moisture and all of that decomposing material inside of the container. The store-bought versions tend to be kind of expensive, but generally are well built. I want to touch on this whole concept of countertop composters quickly. This is becoming a more popular option, especially for folks that live in limited space, or maybe live in a suburb. Maybe their HOA doesn't allow for composting outside or something like that. So we've got products like the Loamy, which is a real cute name because, you know, soil is loamy, and then this device is a Loamy. Just delightful. And then you also have, you know, there's other brands out there too, like the Vitamix Food Cycler. These things are convenient in size, they're convenient to use, but they are very expensive and they use proprietary materials. So the Loamy, for example, you throw your food waste in there and it grinds it up. So it's got a grinding blades in there, and then it heats up really quickly and allows this microbial pod that it has to let the microbes out, kind of do their thing, and then finish the compost for you. Now, I don't have personal experience with one of these units. I just know they're becoming kind of popular with the Suburban set right now. So if anybody has experience with those, or even the Vitamix or one of the other brands that's available, I'd be curious to hear about your experience and kind of what that compost looks like at the end. They're obviously kind of small, so they can only handle so much at once. And it's still one of those things where you don't want to be putting dairy or meat inside of that particular unit.
Hey,
Now
Ash.
let's talk. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
ahead.
I hate to cut you off, but if you're okay with it, can we do some questions real quick before we get to 1 o'clock?
Sure.
We have had a lot of great questions about cover crops as an organic mulch. Can you maybe list a few cover crop options that you would suggest for that? Maybe not go into too much depth because Karen Mitchell will be talking in the future. So
Oh, sure.
a quick comment on that, and then we've got a few other topics that folks have been asking about too.
Okay, great. So cover cropping, it's going to depend on which season you want to be using your cover crop in. So whether it's cool or warm season. A common cool season cover crop to use includes cereal rye. I would also suggest crimson clover, so that way you have a grass and a legume involved. And if you're in the warm season, I really personally like buckwheat. Yes, it's going to set seed, and yes, you're going to have to pull some volunteer buckwheat plants out of the ground. But buckwheat is a quick cover, really good for pollinators in the warm season. You may also consider something like sorghum Sudan grass, or maybe even sun hemp if you're feeling adventurous.
Awesome. We did have another question about the amount of wood ash you could put in your compost, or if that's something you can add to your compost pile bin.
I would say add that carefully because it does have some effects on pH. Microbes exist in a certain pH range, just like you and I exist in a certain pH range. So I would be careful with adding too much of that at once in case it's going to change the pH and then change the microbial community into something that's not going to work as efficiently.
Excellent. This one is a good question. I might know the answer, but I want you, the specialist, to hear it. Is there a way to contain ground ivy organically?
I get this question a lot, and not really. There's not an efficient way to do that. There's not really even an efficient way to do that with certain herbicides. So not bringing it onto the property in the first place, but I know that doesn't help very many people. So just persistence, cutting it back, being persistent is really the only advice I can give on that.
I say the same thing in the turf world. There was a question about genetically modified plants and if those can be used in organic gardens. The GMO.
So if you're not certified organic, you are welcome to use those. I see lots of opportunities for organic modification genetic modification to advance agriculture in ways that could assist organic agriculture. But if you're certified organic, genetic modified foods, genetically modified seeds, all of those types of things are prohibited from use. So as long as you're not certified organic and trying to follow the National Organic Program rules, you can use those in your garden and then continue to do everything else that you typically do in an organic fashion.
Excellent. Well, just for the sake of time, there were a couple questions about using manure and how long that should sit before planting into it. Also, there was a question about using pet manure, something like that. So could you talk about the turnaround if you are using manure as an organic fertilizer? What's the sort of turnaround rate for that, and any sort of guidelines you can touch on for that?
Sure. So the food safety guideline is to make sure that if you're applying fresh manure to the ground, you have to wait 90 days before planting anything into it. And I would generally recommend not using pet manure since many pets can share pathogens with humans. I would generally recommend staying away from things like dog and cat manure for your garden. I guess if you compost it, you could use that with caution, but I would generally stay away from that. Manure otherwise, it's a great idea to make sure that it's composted for a longer period of time. So 90 days is the minimum for raw, but if you're using composted manure, you can use that immediately.
Excellent. And a couple of the other questions that were in here, again, I think what I'll do, we will save those questions for Karen Mitchell because they're more garden related for garden planting. Ashley, if you're okay with it, I apologize to cut you off. If you've got your email address, because I know a lot of these folks, now that they've seen your face and know what you cover, that's how I get a hold of Ashley. If I need something, it's a quick email, knowing that she's busy. You know, we didn't quite get to the worms, and we can stay on for a bit, but I know we're scheduled till 1 o'clock. But it just kind of goes to show how much Ashley does cover in her programming. So a really great resource for educators and community members alike. I did go ahead and put that exit poll link in the chat box. So if you guys could click on that before you head out, we would greatly appreciate that. And Ashley, I'll give you a few more minutes if you're able to stick around. I'm clear for a little bit if people want to stick around. If you have a few more questions, we can just kind of hold it open for a little bit. But
Yep.
we really appreciate you talking and getting our series started off. And the other thing I wanted to mention, a lot of things, our next talk will be February 16th. That's garden planning with Karen Mitchell, consumer horticulture and extension specialist. You guys are kind of lucky if you're here on the live chat. Shoot me an email, shoot Ashley an email. And then if you have specific questions for Karen, we can kind of get those ahead of time. I will be asking her to cover crops in the future sessions. So Ashley, you got a few more minutes if you want to go on, and thanks everybody for joining us. Saw you, Ashley.
All right. So I just want to back up. I can give folks more information about worm composting if they want. But what I was really excited about sharing with some of this animal mediated compost is the concept of using black soldier fly larvae. This is a new development coming from Purdue entomology. Dr. Laura Ingwell, one of our extension entomologists, had a master's student named Katie Terrell that was working on black soldier fly larvae as a compost option for folks, especially in urban gardening situations, but really could be applicable to anybody, because black soldier fly larvae will eat darn near anything, and they can process animal proteins in addition to plant-based materials. So for those of you who are interested, I really just wanted to share the extension publication link to learn more about how to make your own black soldier fly compost bin and how to manage that. I'm just really excited about this opportunity because it opens up so many more avenues for folks to do compost at home when you compare that with microbial composting as well as vermicomposting. So please give that publication a look. It's a really neat, maybe kind of icky, because these are black soldier fly larvae are maggots. It's a fly larva. So that's maybe kind of an ick factor for some of you, but they're very efficient. They're while they're not a native species, they have very little capacity to become invasive because they typically don't survive the winter outdoors here in Indiana. So you could feasibly keep them indoors and keep them going in there. And they just tend to be fairly simple to manage. So I wanted to share that. If anybody has questions specifically about vermicomposting, I'd be happy to kind of touch on some of those. Oklahoma State University has a really great publication available on vermicomposting for those of you who are interested. And just generally want to thank you for your time. Sorry, I ran a little over on that. There's a lot of stuff to cover in this space. So appreciate having a couple extra minutes to share that. And like Jeff said, please email me, call me if you have questions.
Ashley, it sounds like we need to have you on next year, if that's okay.
Any other questions out there? I could probably take a couple more before I got to step away.
I'm looking through the chat box here. Krista, I don't know if you saw any that I missed.
Ashley, one question is, why is non-GMO required in organics?
This is a complicated question to answer, and there is some politicking and some opinion type stuff that goes into this, but one of the big reasons why genetically modified organisms are not approved for use in organic agriculture is because of some concern about genetically modified pollen potentially interfering with other issues on the farm. So there are some potential concerns there with genetically modified DNA getting out into the wild and then making weeds that are also resistant to herbicides and creating an issue. But yeah, there's some other nuances there that I'm not sure that I really want to get into 100% because I have some opinions about it. I don't want my opinion to cloud anybody else's anybody else's look at this, but that's one major reason. And then there's also a focus on traditional breeding, and traditional breeding, for all that it is worth, can be very effective. It's just tends to be slower than some of the more modern methods that we're able to use. And now there are some plant breeding techniques that are not necessarily genetically modified organisms that use a bacteria to insert DNA into the cells of another organism. So there's, as we get farther along and talk about CRISPR-Cas and gene editing, some of that stuff is kind of in a gray area on whether it's considered a genetically modified organism or not. So that's just a little bit of a look on that.
Hey, the other question I stumbled upon, any thoughts or experience with the Johnson Sioux bioreactors for composting?
No, I do not have experience with those, so I'm sorry I can't really speak to that one for you.
And then the other one was, are the flies that you had mentioned, are those a nuisance for livestock?
That's a good question. I would have to point you to Laura Ingwell to answer that question a bit better. I don't believe they are a livestock nuisance. I do know that the larvae are favored by chickens. So you can feed the larvae to chickens once they, if you don't want them to pupate and turn into more black soldier flies, you can actually feed that larva to chickens. So there is a protein benefit for poultry there, but I would have to get you in touch with Laura to see if there are any other potential livestock concerns with the black soldier fly.
Awesome. Krista, am I missing any?
Did we touch on the heat of the compost question? I don't think we did. So there's somebody asking about how to increase the temperature of their composting. They need to improve, do they need to improve the ratio of carbon to nitrogen? He turns it on a weekly basis.
Yeah, so one suggestion I could make is making sure that you're putting more, like if your compost is too cool, you'll want to juice it up with some more greens than browns. Typically compost that is too cool is going to have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than a warmer, like you're going to have, maybe too much sawdust, maybe too much paper in there, because that stuff takes a lot longer for a microbe to break down. So maybe adding some more greens. So, lawn clippings or fruit waste or something like that can kind of help with that, but also making sure that you turn it and aerate it, because the microbes that we want breaking down that material are aerobic. They need air to survive. And if you have too much anaerobic bacteria in there, they may just be, taking up too much space and colonizing too much space for some of those other bacteria that we want that create those temperature differences, that they just might be out competing them.
And actually, if you're good for a couple more questions, there was one that was good. They were just looking for a little clarification between wood chips specifically and mulch, and then when do you mulch?
Sure. So wood chips, we're talking like that could mean a couple different things. You're right. So fresh wood chips and older wood chips are going to be a little bit different. Like if you have mulch out in your flower beds, for example, that's been there for 2 or 3 years, that is going to be a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio material than like fresh sawdust or freshly chipped wood. So if we're talking about mulching in the garden, usually a fresher material is going to do better in terms of a weed control standpoint and in terms of a longevity standpoint. If you have older mulch that's been sitting out for a while, it can still do some good, but it's going to break down fairly quickly. In terms of timing, I would try to get that mulch out as early as possible, especially, as soon as the soil is, not too soggy to work on. So as soon as it dries out a little bit, apply that mulch, take care of some of your winter annual weeds that might be trying to pop through early in the gardening season. But it's also a good idea to kind of top it off every once in a while. As you see that mulch breaking down, you might consider putting down fresh mulch once a year, maybe even more frequently, depending on how wet your area is. And Karen might have some more advice about mulching in the garden as well. So definitely keep some of these questions in mind for her as you move toward next week.
Yeah, I got some notes for her to cover. But with that, I just want to say thanks everyone for joining us for our first monthly hot topics. Feel free to reach out to myself or one of the other educators, and Ashley. We'll keep things posted or headed your way as we get questions, and hopefully this has been a good outreach for you. And that was kind of the whole point, was kind of get your work out there, and we appreciate you covering all that good information with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for your attention today, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I'm seeing lots of good questions in the chat. So if you have more stuff, ask Karen or send me an email later. And I'm really glad to see that Candace has had a good experience with her Lomi composter.
That's what we like to hear from the public, those anecdotes. It's not data, but hey, we'll take it. So yeah, we'll wrap it up. I can stay on for a few more minutes. Krista, Courtney, if you want to stick around for a minute. But otherwise, we will see you guys all next month. Thanks again.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to jump off as well.
Thanks, Ashley. We really
Thanks,
appreciate it.
Ashley.
So again, sorry I ran over a little bit, but lots of good questions and good chat. So I'm glad we didn't miss out on some of that. So thanks
Well,
again
and I
for
think it's
allowing a little
great.
extra time.
Yeah, if you're okay with it, because I've listened to your worm composting thing. We might call you for next year.
No, I'd be happy to do a session on that. I think that stuff's really fun and people they generate a lot of excitement and questions around that. So
Yeah, I'll probably see you on, are you on Kyle Daniels Zoom this afternoon?
nope, not this time, but sometimes.
Gotcha.
Well, maybe this time. Is it an advisory thing?
I have no idea.
Can't remember.
It's on my calendar. That's all I know. So
He's my next door neighbor here at the building. So sometimes
gotcha. Oh, so you're on the 3rd floor, aren't you?
yeah. Penthouse.
Yep.
All right.
You don't-
Thanks, you guys. We'll see you later.
Thanks,
Bye,
Ashley.
Ashley. Thank
Bye.
you.
Courtney and Krista, just for some housekeeping stuff. And if you guys are still on the Zoom call, we're just going to do some housekeeping stuff. So probably you can listen in. I don't really care, but I am going to stop the recording. What do I do? Send it to the cloud, Courtney and Krista?
I think so.